Hello everyone around the world. A very warm welcome to the research conference of the 5th Annual Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy Week. My name is Joe Yates and I'm one of the few privileged people to work in the organising committee of this event, but with a very large number of contributors all around the world. I'm not going to lie to you, we are in totally uncharted territory this year. Running the Academy Week online has been a brand new experience for us as conference curators and organisers. So I'd like to expend a special thank you to you all for joining us on this journey. With your support and enthusiasm, we're going to try a few new things over the next coming days. So please get involved with as much as you can so we can collectively move the needle forward on virtual events. COVID-19 and its collateral has laid bare some of the most fundamental pre-existing inequities among our global and local societies, not least among both health systems and food systems, with disproportionate vulnerabilities, resiliences, and health outcomes serving as stark indications of how power, privilege, and agency clearly exist for some, but not for others. While it threatens to undo decades of gradual improvements in some forms of malnutrition and health, there's no doubt that our food systems have not been delivering healthy, sustainable, and equitable diets for long until now for many of the world's population. This pandemic has literally left us at a physical distance from one another, meaning that of course we can't be in Malawi this year, unfortunately, as was planned. And I'd like to extend a special thanks to our colleagues and friends and co-hosts at the Lilongwe University of Agriculture and Natural Resources, as well as the University of Malawi, for all of the hard work that they put into the early days of planning this event. We really hope to be back in Malawi next year together, if the situation permits. Now, although we can't be together in person this year, in many ways it really does feel like, as a global community of researchers and practitioners, we may be more together than ever. Recent conversations, dialogues, discussions, and webinars seem to suggest that there is a strong and united voice pushing to seize the impetus of this historic moment in time to build better, more sustainable, equitable food systems amid this unprecedented pressure of a global pandemic and a climate crisis. But to do this, we must address questions head on about exactly how power, privilege, and agency not only determine diets, nutrition, and health through food systems and across food systems, but how they sustain inequities within the very world of science and policy that we as researchers and practitioners inhabit. And of course, this great reflection comes at a time when long overdue conversations and actions around racial discrimination and injustice are taking place, for which we express our absolute solidarity. It's against this backdrop that we bring to you perhaps the most timely and exciting ANH Academy Week yet, a programme full to the brim of the latest evidence from around the world, delivered by some of the most innovative researchers from diverse geographies, disciplines, sectors and disciplines, and seniorities, But the week's not just about evidence, it's also about the spirit of learning and sharing. What's worked, what hasn't worked, what new questions might need to be asked, and who should be generating these questions in the first place, and how should they be answered? It's also about fun, and it's not a stuffy event, I promise you. This is about as formal as it gets. I've not worn a shirt in months, so this is new for me as well. In a few minutes, I'd like to take you on a quick tour of the programme before handing over to Sunita Kadiyala, who will be introducing our keynote speaker. However, if you have a spare few minutes before that, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the ANH Academy that you are part of. The ANH Academy is one of the 3 work streams of the Innovative Methods and Metrics for Agriculture and Nutrition's Actions Programme, IMANA, which is co-funded by UK aid from the UK government and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Through a competitive grant scheme, which funds the development and validation of novel interdisciplinary tools, methods, and metrics, a fellowships programme aimed at career development for future research leaders, and the ANH Academy itself. IMANA seeks to accelerate progress on tools, data, and capacity needed to guide evidence-based policy in agriculture food systems for nutrition and health. The ANH Academy itself is part of a broader coalition of partners and was jointly founded in 2015 by IMANA, as well as the London Centre for Integrative Research on Agriculture and Health and the CGIAR research programme on agriculture for nutrition and health. It's a global community of researchers, practitioners and policymakers working at the intersections of agriculture food systems for nutrition and health outcomes. We're a platform for learning and sharing, and we have a very strong emphasis on lowering barriers to participation and engagement. The ANH Academy has 4 major goals. The first of which is to build and strengthen an interdisciplinary community to share innovative research in agriculture, nutrition and health, but also to share practice, experience and shared ideas. The second is to stimulate the development and harmonization of new types of research and to help strengthen the capacity of the research community to undertake intersectoral and interdisciplinary types of explorations. Finally, the ANH Academy is tasked with facilitating the uptake of robust evidence policies and programme. Our guiding ethos, as a reminder, is to lower barriers to engagement and to foster equitable collaboration. As you can see from this slide, we have members all over the world in over 110 countries. And you can see also that the Academy is really designed to be an inclusive initiative, from anthropologists to agricultural economists, gender specialists, climate scientists, nutritionists, modelers, you name it, practitioners. It's a broad church, it's a big tent, and anyone is welcome who is interested in improving nutrition and health, particularly via leveraging food systems and agriculture. To achieve these goals, the ANH Academy has a range of activities which seem to be evolving all the time. You're now taking part in our flagship event, which is the ANH Academy Week, which in normal times rotates between Africa and Asia each year. But as you can see from this screen, we have many other different initiatives going on. I'm not going to talk about them all now, but some of the 2 key initiatives that are emerging as part of our second programme over the summer are a synthesis centre on agriculture and nutrition health research, and also a mentoring and curriculum development scheme. And do listen out later in the week to contribute to some of these ideas that are now taking place, because they will help to shape the initiatives that come thereafter. ANH Academy has a broad remit for synthesis, and what you're looking at now are just some of the thematic areas that fall within this function. We constitute international expert technical working groups to synthesize experience in tools, methods and metrics in order to facilitate their greater use and acceleration in research as well as practice, especially across disciplines that are disparate and often have different ideas and concepts. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the ANH Academy. I hope you're interested. You're now members if you're joining this event, and I hope you'll use the event itself to connect with other members, to find out people who may be working on things similar to you, but importantly, things that are different to you or coming from different disciplinary perspectives. Please do connect with members. Please do consider sharing your information, tools, evidence, experiences. We are very happy to help you share this, whether it's through webinars that you might want to propose, or blogs, or any kind of other activity. We're open to suggestions. So please do get in touch. Now then, back to the event at hand. So before I hand over to Sunitha, I just want to say a few things about the Academy Week itself. This event is non-commercial. You know, it is driven and fueled on the absolute generosity, on goodwill of the collective global community. We have a large international scientific committee, as well as a logistics and organizational committee. And it simply wouldn't be possible to arrange this event without the countless number of hours and effort that people put in out of the goodness of their heart. We also have this year to host the online event, which is completely new territory for us, as I've said, a whole range of planners, session managers and support, which you'll see popping up during sessions. This includes the ELSERA programming team, our MANA and A4NH staff, as well as previous Academy Week co-host volunteers from both Ghana and India. We've received some really fantastic advice on virtual event hosting from the group at Tufts University, the Mulch program, who have been working on this kind of initiative long before COVID made it fashionable. And I want to say a big thanks in advance to all of our session chairs who have given up their time as well to take part and drive the discussions that are going to form the backbone of the program this week. And of course, to everyone who's taken part, the participants. So the Academy Week is usually spread over 5 days. Its the first 2 days are usually learning labs, and the following 3 days are a research conference. But this year, taking on advice from lots of different groups, we decided to slim down and spread it over 2 weeks so that we could maximize our reach into different time zones. And therefore, the learning labs actually started last week, and many of you would have attended. In fact, 722 people attended the learning labs last week, which is a record for us. We had 12 labs led by 34 facilitators from 17 institutions, supported by 38 support staff and volunteers. And I just want to say again, a huge thank you to all the experts around the world who so generously give up their time and expertise every year to run these learning labs. The resources can be found on our website, so if you didn't make it to the learning lab, you can catch up, and do get in touch if there's anything you need. And a quick word on the participant numbers. They're going up all the time, so we can't keep up, but the last time we checked, we had people visiting from over 125 countries, which is amazing. We had 3,500 registrants as of last night, which means we're over 10 times our usual offering when we host a physical event. So there's definitely something to be learned about the demand out there and the interest and what you can do when you host events online also. Now then, I've been talking for quite a while and you're probably thinking, oh no, I've signed up for yet another boring Zoom fest. Well, I don't blame you. I did practice this a few times last night and almost fell asleep myself, to be honest. But I have got some good news. The Academy Week is not designed to be a passive experience. Anyone who's come to the real event, the physical event, will tell you that it's highly interactive. It's all about participation. It's all about breaking down barriers between people that might exist in other environments. And so this year, we're really trying to emulate that online, and we want you to jump into the spirit of the event. And what I'm going to do now is bring in my close colleague and friend, Abel Andashur, to see if he can tell you a little bit more about the culture and the structure of this year's event. So Abel, are you there? Should we test the technology?
Yeah. Hi, Joe. How are you?
Oh, where are you?
Oh, I'm in Malawi, by Lake Malawi.
What? Malawi? I thought it was postponed.
Oh, you didn't get the new memo from Jeff and Sunita?
Ah, no one copies me in these days.
Ah, I'm just kidding, actually. I'm actually at home. I'm just going to show you. I was trying to show participants that they can actually change their virtual background. You know, changing your virtual background is one thing, but if you're struggling with your internet connection, you might want to turn off your video, and that's fine. Maybe it would be nice for you to put your profile photo then, so that we can see your smiling faces. To do this, it's easy. When you turn off your video, you can add your profile photo by right-clicking on your name in the Zoom window for most of the parallel sessions. We're using the webinar future now, so you can't do that one. So maybe you can try it later on, once we're done with the opening ceremony. As you all know, some of the most common used words on a virtual conference during this pandemic are, I'm sorry, I was on mute. Can everyone see my screen now? Next slide, please. And of course, can you email that to everyone, which is referring to the PowerPoint slides. Luckily, for ANH Academy Week, we don't have to email all the PowerPoints. Most of them are already on our website. Now, I want to take you through the ANH Academy Week program. With the human attention span falling by the year, coupled with a lot of online materials and pressure on both personal and professional lives due to the pandemic, we are aware that people have less time perhaps than ever. In light of this, you can find a wealth of conference resources on our site that you can engage with on your own time. This includes short thematic animations of each oral abstracts using the description of presenters themselves. And this year's thematic parallel sessions do have two features. One is the pre-recorded 7 minutes oral presentation video. And the other one will be the live sessions, of which we hope all of you will join us in the next 2 days. the pre-recorded presentations for all abstracts are already uploaded into our website. If possible, we encourage you to watch all of them. But if not, maybe make sure to watch at least for the sessions that you'll be joining. By doing so, you will increase participation and engagement during the live session. For the live session, presenters will summarize their work in 3 minutes, leaving us a lot of time for Q&A and discussion. For better experience and engagement, watching the pre-recorded materials is highly recommended before you join any of the parallel sessions. You'll also find the full abstracts, the slides on our website, so please use the rich materials we've put together in the resource section of our website. Finally, to the unique feature of ANH Academy Week, which is the 1-minute poster presentation. Normally, this will be an opportunity for presenters to present and summarize their work in 60 seconds. That's quite a challenge. And by doing so, they will entice participants to go and engage with them during the poster viewing time. Good news, you can also do that this year. Slightly different though. We have all the poster presentations on our website, on the poster hall section, and during the break and poster viewing time, we encourage you to visit the poster hall and learn more about their research. And finally, the social hangouts part. As you know, we have different social activities on the physical ANH Academy Week. Reception and networking activity at the opening day of the Learning Labs and the Research Conference, and the famous Thursday night cultural events, an informal night to socialize with everyone, including organizers and presenters. This year, we've put together some interesting social activities, ranging from stretching exercise for desk-stressed people, to PhD memes for PhD students, to musical instruments around the world, to anyone interested in music. We also have some very serious social hangouts, like the Imana Fellowships, for anyone who wants to know more about the Imana Fellowships program, and the ANH mentoring scheme. So please join each day for these social activities at the start and end of the research conference. We also have few spots to anyone who wants to organize their own social hangouts during these times. And we would be more than happy to facilitate this. Just let us know. Finally, we want to encourage you to connect and engage with the speakers on our website. And of course, by using the conference hashtag online, hashtag ANH2020. Before I handed it to Joe and Sunita, I have a few technical announcements to ensure that our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible for this opening ceremony. First, this session will be recorded. I hope you all are aware of that. And it will be posted on the ANH Academy website. Second, all participants are currently muted. Please introduce yourself. I can see some of you have already started introducing yourself. Tell us your name, where you're joining us from, the organizations that you work with. You can access the chat box by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you have questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box throughout the session, and we will do our best to raise them during the Q&A session. If we have time, we may ask participants to raise their hands so that they can ask their question using the audio function. Finally, if at any point you experience any technical issues, please check your audio setting and your internet connection. You can always reconnect using the same Zoom link. I think that's it for me, Joe. Back to you.
Thanks, Abel. And it's important to note that you can always change room as well. I've just moved now into my extensive library for the rest of the conference because I feel like it's going to be a place that I can really soak up as much knowledge as possible. So it's actually my great pleasure now to officially inaugurate the event and hand over to Sunita Kadiyala, who's going to take it from here. So over to you, Sunita.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Abel. A very warm welcome from me to everyone and from all of us here. Many of you have been our long-standing fellow travelers on this journey, and we are delighted that many more of you joined us online. While we were nervous about taking the conference online, as several of you know, the ANH Academy is bold in its approach and not shy of innovation. We have plenty of that in the next 3 days, and we welcome your active participation and feedback. We are delighted that the research conference is starting with a keynote address by Professor Angus Deaton, a Nobel laureate in economics. In preparation for my opening remarks, I started rereading the papers I read before and furiously started catching up on his more recent works. Any one of us who take a few minutes to Google him can come up with a long list of accomplishments and contributions in a very short time. This includes his exceptionally important body of work on how we measure and understand consumption, poverty, inequality, and human well-being. His analysis of household survey book was an essential reading in my survey design class at Tufts. And I want to remind you that I'm actually a nutritionist. And you all know that this is a holy text for any one of us using multi-purpose household survey data. So instead of recapping all his accomplishments for you, I thought I would highlight a few of Professor Deaton's characteristics and accomplishments that you will not find neatly wrapped up in any Wikipedia page. In putting these remarks together, I also reached out to some friends and colleagues, especially Professor Will Masters and Professor Bhavani Shankar. In that sense, these remarks are a collective contribution in the true spirit of the ANH Academy. This is not a stratified random sample, Professor Deaton, but my convenient sampling gets to the heart of the matter. Professor Deaton, as several of us know, developed the almost ideal demand system, the now standard method used to analyze survey data and understand how dietary intake responds to changes in people's circumstances, like income, prices, now under the common parlance of what we are calling the food environments. He developed a metric called the net benefit ratio, which furthered research on how price changes hurt or benefit farmers. But he accomplished these econometric feats with humility. As Will Masters put it, with deep respect for people's agency and dignity. As members of the ANH Academy, we are all interested in connecting the dots across disciplines and crossing disciplinary bridges. Professor Deaton provided several of us gathered here today with such inspiration. He inspired several nutritionists like me who ended up studying a fair bit of economics. Hold on, did I say fair bit of economics? That is brave of me virtually sitting next to a Nobel laureate in economics to claim that I know a fair bit of economics. Let me track back and say that I dabbled in some economics because of him and Amartya Sen. His recent work with Professor Ann Kay shows how one needs to and can continue to broaden horizons to truly affect change. His recent work, Deaths of Despair, broadens and deepens our understanding of inequality and survival and how mental health intersects with these. I see two key ways pertinent for us here at the ANH Academy in how he builds these bridges. One is with his stunning clarity and economy that marks his writing without any mathematical acrobatics, as Professor Bhavani Shankar put it. The second is that Professor Deaton doesn't only write for other high priests of economics, but for a diverse set of stakeholders from practitioners to researchers in other disciplines. His willingness to publish his important work in an outlet like the Economic and Political Weekly from India, which is sort of in India's version of Foreign Affairs, is a testimony to his commitment to effect change on the ground. I know from my own engagement and observations in India how this article in 2009 in the Economic and Political Weekly made various ministries in India, to nutritionists, to social scientists, to activists question how India measures poverty and call for better economic as well as nutrition surveys. Over the years, funnily enough, my friends and colleagues, we were young then, on various occasions said they had dinner with Angus Deaton. It got me wondering, well, either the professor likes his dinners or keen to engage with young researchers or both. I wanted to ground truth this observation and I asked around. The answer was unequivocal. His commitment to support students, female researchers and others has been front and central to his career and his general conduct. Professor Deaton In our question and answers, we would definitely like to hear your reflections and advice on mentorship and support to early career researchers across the world. This goes to the heart and ethos of the ANH Academy. Thank you for being here with us today. I would love to invite you now to deliver your address. I encourage everyone of the participants to lodge your questions in the chat box as we expect a very interesting Q&A session. Thank you very much. Professor Deaton, on to you.
Thank you so much, Sunita. I'm not at all sure that I can, oops, let's get these slides in order. Anyway, they're in order. So thank you very much. I cannot imagine that I can live up to that very, very generous introduction. I would like to say, however, that I noticed on your slide, there's a Twitter handle for me that's a fake, which turns out is impossible to make go away. But it's just one of these things that happens. So I'm going to talk today about inequality, nutrition, and health, and I'm going to range fairly widely, and I hope that it will be entertaining as well as informative. Let me tell you a little about myself first, though Sunita already told you a lot. I was born a very long time ago in Edinburgh, in Scotland, at the very end of World War II. I'm an economist, not a general knowledge scholar of nutrition, so please keep that in mind. There will be things I show you that you know more about than I do. But growing up in Scotland and Britain at the end of World War II is important in a number of ways. One is that unlike almost all other European countries during the war, health and nutritional status improved in Britain during those years. One of the things that as a child we all took for granted was the milk distribution system, and the milkman came to the door every morning. That was started during the war. Prior to World War II, most people didn't drink milk, but put canned milk in their tea. It was preserved after the war, and the milkman became a British institution. Rationing was developed by economists and was enormously successful and popular. And for those of you who've not studied that episode, it's a wonderful story of a very successful nutritional public policy. I remember my father very carefully using his food and sweet coupons for candy. He kept them in a well-hidden tin, though of course his children found them pretty quickly. But nevertheless, I've always thought it had something to do with my good dental hygiene. My mother, I remember going up the street to the newly founded National Health Service, which distributed free orange juice, vitamin, cod liver oil, all without payment for me and my sister. I was never hungry as a child, but we had no money, or at least we were short. And what I want to, why I'm starting here is because it's very important, I think, to realize, as I realized throughout my career, that collective action is important, not just the market, though the market can be important too. And of course, economists like to study the market, to talk about prices and incomes, but there are some things that we can only do together, and it needs public action to make them happen. And of course, I'm talking in the middle of a pandemic, and we should know that. Even if we'd forgotten it, we should be reminded of it now. Here's a little bit of my own journey on these topics. The first work I did, first job I had as economist was working with Richard Stone in Cambridge from 1969 to 76. And he ran a thing called the Cambridge Growth Model. And you might remember there was something called indicative planning. It wasn't planning in the Soviet sense, or even in the Indian sense, but it was a way of examining alternative futures, alternative growth paths, and identifying what were likely to be blocks and so on. I was part of the team, and my job was to look after consumers. I guess they didn't have anyone to do that at that point, so I worked on saving and consumption, the decision how much to save, but also on the demand for individual goods and services, including the demand for food. I'd been a mathematician before, and I developed computational methods for estimating Stone's linear expenditure system. It's a nonlinear model, and the estimation was not straightforward, even in 1969, let alone in 1954 when he invented it. If you read that original paper, you'll discover the word computer appears, but it's spelled with an O. And what it means when it's spelled with an O is the computer was a person, not a machine. And that his estimation was sort of done by hand. I became interested in demand for food, as well as in the well-being implications for demand analysis. And beyond that, from material well-being to health, including nutrition. And of course, I was enormously influenced by Richard Stone, especially in his empirical ideas and the fact that he wrote so beautifully. Amartya Sen was there at that time, and he's always been a huge influence on me. And by Simon Kuznets, who I didn't know, but I did read a lot of. So, you know, food is one of the oldest topics in economics. Of course, it's central in nutrition. But it's amazing how much there is there and how much there's still not understood. You'll all be familiar with Engel's law, that the share of food declines with income. Alfred Marshall thought it was because the human stomach had limitations. But there are various contradictions to that. One is Kuznets pointed out that in his examination of the historical series in the 60s, that a lot of food is not food, and there's a big break between expenditures on the one hand and nutrition on the other hand. It was not so clear to him that the share of food actually fell in the US and UK as those countries became richer. And one of my very first papers was actually about that. Later, working at the World Bank, looking at household surveys for the first time, this was in the 80s, we often find that Engel's law appeared to fail among the very poorest households. There was another work that I did with Chris Paxson in which there's a paradox, which as far as I know is still not satisfactory to resolve, that if you add a person to a family and add enough income to make per capita income the same, so it's like sending a person along with enough money to keep the money up, then the family should be better off because there are always some sort of economies of scale. You don't need two of everything when two people get together. But it turns out that per capita food consumption is lower in such circumstances, even in the poorest countries. And we still don't quite know what that is, though I think it's probably linked with the last point here, that growth and calorie decline in some poor countries. When they get richer, the demand for calories appears to fall. So I'll come back to that. Let me talk about some general background, though, about growth and inequality around the world. The great episodes of human progress, what I called the Great Escape in my previous book, from destitution, hunger, ill health, and premature mortality to a longer life, to healthy bodies, productive work, and high material living standards. And that's not all that's happened over the last 250 years. We have better governance, more democracy, reductions in violence, and measures of happiness, to the extent that we believe them, are going up. Now, progress has often been interrupted, sometimes brutally. Some of the worst events in human history happened in the 20th century, but has always resumed. And in fact, many people worry that the episode we're going through now is another one of these things. But I'm always optimistic that in the end we will come back. Now, here's a picture which was first drawn by Sam Preston in 1975, which shows life expectancy at birth on the vertical axis and GDP per capita in international dollars along the horizontal axis. And what you see here is this onward and upwards thing. The big gray arrow there is to emphasize that we're moving upwards along both axes. We're getting richer and we're also living longer, and that health and wealth sort of go together. You can see the colors, or the sizes, the areas of the blobs are proportional to population. So you can see the biggest ones are China and India. The biggest one on the top right is the United States, which as always does badly on health relative to its total GDP. The other thing that's important to note about this is that these curves, countries are not just moving to the right and upwards over time in the direction of the arrow, but the curve itself is moving upwards over time. And that's because it seems that as time goes on, we get more health for the same amount of dollars. So there's a sort of progress that's nothing to do with money. So here's some of the stories about what drives the Preston curve. Higher income promotes better health. Some of that works through the market. Food is an important mechanism, better quality, better variety, and more quantity. The state is very important in this too, and this is straight off a theme of this lecture, that public health is as important. Water, vector control, stopping open defecation, vaccinations, and changes in the pattern of disease through the epidemiological transition. There are also important interactions between food and disease, which have always made this controversial and difficult to handle. That poorly nourished people are often less able to resist infection, and sick people may not be able to absorb food. And that points to something that will come up several times in this lecture, that it's net nutrition that always matters, not just intake. And it's amazing how often that's forgotten by economists in particular, less so by nutritionists. I've talked about the curve moving up. One example is oral rehydration therapy. That means that you can have more health even at very low incomes. State capacity, and not just state capacity, but the use of state capacity is important for delivery. America right now has an enormous amount of state capacity, but it's just not using it very well during this pandemic. The low life expectancy is largely in poor countries, largely kids who die from diseases that are no longer important in rich countries. And it's often said that across the transition, disease moves from the bowels of children into the arteries of old people. I just wanted to show you a couple of examples. The red blobs here are Britain, where some of you, I believe, are sitting. And you can see the upward progress over time. One of my favorite ones here, I put France on this one as a comparison, is Korea, South Korea.
Professor Deaton?
Yes.
We cannot hear you.
Well,
sorry, something seemed to have gone wrong.
When did that happen?
Maybe you could re-explain this curve just now.
Oh, you want me to go back to the first curve?
Oh, everyone else could hear, I believe. No, not the second one. Second one. Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
I
think this is fine. A lot of people said they can. Okay. Thank you.
Good. My microphone is switched on and I can see the little green thing going up and down as I talk. So
sorry about that. Yeah.
Thank
you everyone for letting us know that you can hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Please do pile in if needs. South Korea is an example that's spectacular in many, many ways. And one here is, this is one of the records, this enormous increase in life expectancy and in GDP per capita as it traverses across the Preston curve in a relatively short period of time. Sunita suggested I talk a little bit about inequality, poverty, growth in general. There are obvious links with food, that falling global inequality raises the demand for food, conditional on global income, simply because poorer people spend more on food than richer people. Similarly, rising inequality within countries, which is what we've seen in recent years, reduces the demand for food. Inequality within households can stunt whole populations. That's relevant for India, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And falling poverty obviously raises the market demand for food directly because people have more to spend. But it's also true that more goes through the market, home production falls, there's a switch to more processing and more distribution. So as countries get richer, you're not looking at the demand for food as a different demand, there's other things mixed in there. It's also true, as I'll talk about later, that the use of food to fuel heavy manual worker may fall too. It's often said that that inequality in the world is increasing, and it's said so often in the press and by so many people, yet it's not true. And it's really because India and China have 2.5 billion people, and with their rapid growth until the pandemic, they're moving from the bottom to the middle. And that fact that global inequality is falling is consistent with inequality increasing in every country in the world, including India and China, which many people find very hard. They say, if inequality is growing in every country, it must be growing in the world. Not true. And let me show you just a little bit here. Here's a picture which shows a plot of growth rates against GDP per capita. And the light circles are for 1970, the dark circles for 1960, and it's the annual growth in the next 40 or 50 years after that. And you can see that there's a wide variety of growth experiences at different levels of income. There's a slight tendency for lower incomes to lower countries to grow more rapidly, lower GDP countries to grow more rapidly. But that does not really explain falling global inequality. What does is this, which is these two graphs are identical, but all I've done is made the blobs proportional to the population size of the country. And now you can see why this is happening, that the two biggest countries in the world, India and China, are among the fastest growing, and they're moving enormous numbers of people, 2.5 billion people or more, up from the very bottom of the world distribution towards the middle of the world distribution, and that's profoundly equalizing. So that's why world inequality is falling. I wanted to show you briefly Branko Milanovic's elephant, as it's so called. This is very controversial, but I think it's still recognized as broadly right. The elephant is sort of sketched in here, but the blue line is the relevant one. And the bottom measures the percentiles. These are people now, the percentiles of the global income distribution. So down near zero, those are the very poorest people in the world. At the top, you've got the very richest people in the world. And what you see here is the very poorest people in the world have not done so well. Many of them live in sub-Saharan Africa. As you move up to the middle, these people have had a lot of economic growth over this 20-year period. And that's India and China in the middle. And then as you get up to the 80th percentile, which are workers, the poorest people in better off middle income or high income countries, they are the ones who've seen very, very little growth. And in fact, many of them have done really badly. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the super rich, the people at the very, very top of the income distribution, are the people who've really been making out like crazy. And that's the top of the elephant's trunk there. And this is worth keeping in mind, because holding this in your head tells you a lot about what's happening in the world today. Let me talk a little bit about the US, which I've been working on a lot. Recently, there's been a great deal of economic growth, and it's not shared equally. And one of the greatest divides is between those with and without a 4-year college degree. To get a BA in the US, you have to go to school for 4 years, as opposed to 3 years, for instance, in much of Europe. For men, real wages have fallen for nearly 50 years. Labor force participation for men has fallen for decades now, and for women since 2000. Notice that if your labor supply is going down and real wages are going down, that must be driven by falling demand for people. But it's not just the labor force that's failing them. Marriage rates have fallen. Church attendance has fallen, enormously important in the US. Hardly any private sector unions anymore. There's a lot of rising pain, rising social isolation, loneliness, and mortality rates have written what Ann Case and I call deaths of despair, which are suicides, drug overdoses, and alcoholic liver disease, but also cardiovascular disease has stopped falling. This graph, which you're the first people ever to see, since I only made this yesterday, shows life expectancy at 25 for people with a BA, for the whole population, and without a BA. You can see this is slowing a bit. But the people with a BA are going on doing just fine, whereas the people without a BA, their life expectancy is actually falling. I mean, it's just a terrible divide, not just in terms of income, but in terms of health too. Here's a graph of mortality rates for people aged 45 to 54 for a bunch of countries. You can see in all these countries, things are getting better, except for white people in the United States where things are getting worse. So we're a real egregious outlier here. So why is life so hard for the less educated these days? It's true, I think, but to a lesser extent for less educated workers throughout the rich world. But the deaths seem to be unique to the United States. Part of it is stagnant wages for long periods of time, 50 years in the US, but it's happening in Britain and Germany too. Globalization and automation are real threats to poorer workers in the rich countries. Remember, these are the people at the bottom of Milanovic's trunk. Falling unionization rates, much fiercer and less forgiving capitalism. And also political change and inequality, which I think are not always stated obviously enough. The social democratic parties, Labour Party in Britain, the Democratic Party in the US, used to ally with labor and working people and draw their politicians from them, but they've now become parties of the educated and globalized elite, leaving little bit populace for the workers. I want to talk a little bit about heights, which I spent quite a lot of time thinking about. I'm a tall person myself, and so I think heights are interesting, worth thinking about. And indeed, my height, I attribute at least a little to the National Health Service in Britain after the war. Adult height, we generally think, is set early in childhood by net nutritional levels and changes little in adulthood, at least until you start shrinking after age 50. So what we call the tree ring method of using height by age reads back the history of net nutrition. So you can have a survey at a moment in time, and if you look at the 50-year-olds, it tells you what nutrition was like 50 years before. If you look at the 40-year-old, 40 years before, and you can read off the history of childhood nutrition from those graphs. We also know that in the US and UK today, taller people are on average smarter and earn more. You get into terrible trouble for saying that. Of course, there's nothing at all being wrong with being short, provided that is your genetic destiny. But what seems to happen is if you don't get enough to eat in childhood and your brain doesn't develop properly by the time you're 5 or 7, you have some cognitive penalty in adulthood. In Europe and the US, around the world, height has increased with GDP per capita. The record increase, and my friends in Korea, again, 20 centimeters in 100 years. The standard rate, which is half the Korean rate, is about 1 centimeter per decade. Across poor countries, heights are uncorrelated with GDP per head in the birth year. And again, coming back to my friends in India, they're among the shortest in the world after thousands of years of inadequate nutrition. Let me show you this picture. And this is a plot against the log of GDP per head in the year of birth. These come from the demographic and health surveys around the world and shows average height. And the first thing you see is the onward and upward arrow again, that in the, especially driven by the blue countries, which are Europe and the US, as GDP has increased since the war, there's been an enormous increase in height. European populations getting taller over time. But what is interesting is if you take those blue guys away, these blue dots away, what you're left with is something that has no slope at all. I mean, it's just basically a zero correlation, that some of the rich countries do well and some of them don't. So across the world, income and nutrition are just not that strongly linked. And that's once again making the point, which I want to make throughout this lecture, that the links are much more complicated than just having enough income. India is one of the most rapidly growing countries in terms of GDP per capita. yet adult heights have been growing at only half the standard rates and much more slowly among women than men, about a third of the male rate. It'll take 200 years at current trends for the average Indian woman to be as tall as the average British woman. Open defecation is still widespread and population density is high, and there's good evidence that that really hurts things. An important link with inequality here is the discrimination, routine discrimination in much of Indian society against women in food and in other things. So especially among young married women living with their mothers-in-law. My student Diane Coffey has shown that Indian women weigh less at the end of their pregnancies than African women do at the start of theirs. This deprivation, this discrimination, this inequality keeps down, of course, the height, the size of babies, and those babies are both male and female. So the male discrimination against women hurts both men and women, and it's a very important example of how inequality against women in this case hurts development, and it hurts the development, of course, of men as well as of women. The Asian enigma: Africa is much poorer than India, but Africans are taller than India. Dean Spears, his colleague, made a good case that population density and open defecation explain much of this, and also the Muslim paradox in India, that Muslims are much poorer and less educated, but have lower infant mortality. So let me tell you a little bit more about India. Rapid rates of economic growth, and half the kids are severely malnourished by height and weight. And yet per capita calorie and protein consumption fell from 1983 to 2005 by actually a considerable amount. And you know, when I first started studying economics and development, one of the first things I thought was, these kids are hungry, they're short because they live in a poor country. And yet here is this poor country stopping being a poor country, and per capita calorie consumption is going down. Fat consumption is doing okay. In the most recent data, and as many of you will know, not all the data in India have recently been released, there was some increase in calories from 11 to 12. So maybe this phenomenon is stopping as people begin to consume more. But the large prior decrease in calorie per capita is hard to explain. And of course, it's very important to think about and understand this as the future of global poverty falls. Will the demand for food perhaps not increase as we would expect? Is rising income perhaps not the answer to better nutrition? So there have been many stories in the Indian context, only one of which makes much sense. As people in states get richer, the demand for food is offset by reductions in heavy manual labor. There's better roads, better water supply, more sanitation, more mechanization, less disease. Heavy work is undesirable. So one of the things that people do as they get richer is do less heavy work. It's a very, very important and deeply underappreciated mechanism, certainly in economics, that one of the things people like to do as they get richer is not do back-breaking manual work. As one of my friends in Kerala said, it means that people stop living like animals and start living like people. As they give up and reduce their workload, the calories and proteins that are required as fuel for work actually diminish, even though the quality of food may actually improve. Eventually, of course, this process ends when we're all sitting in armchairs, and then you get onto that European branch of the income and height picture that I showed you before. This is some evidence that basically, depending on the sort of labor you do, the amount of calories you consume is very different. I also wanted to show you these very quickly. These show district maps of India with fraction of households with access to piped drinking water in 1981. The lighter is worse, 1991 and 2001. So that's one of the major factors helping here. Let me say a few words about poverty lines as calorie lines. The poverty line in India was originally, well, not originally, there's a very long old history, which I'm not going to tell you about. It was originally set at the level of per capita household expenditure, at which per capita calorie consumption were the recommended amounts of 2,400 in the rural and 2,100 in the urban. After that, so you might think that people who don't get these calorie things, that's the definition of poverty. If you don't get those calorie things, you're poor. But that's not what happened, because what happened was these poverty lines were updated for inflation with no further reference to calories. So if we define poverty by counting the number of people below the lines, well, remember, calorie consumption is going down. So what we've got is poverty going up in India from 1983 to 2005. So the number of people below the calorie norms is increasing because calorie consumption is going down. And of course, many people in India argued that that was what was happening. There was spreading poverty, that globalization of markets were actually hurting people. But, you know, that just doesn't show up in the data at all. And so, you know, this is a place where nutritionists and economists sort of cross paths here, because there's a very strong emotional connotation for most people between hunger and poverty. And people left to themselves will define poverty as not getting enough to eat. But you live in a world with falling calories, then you're going to be increasing poverty, whatever else is going on, even though I think that's wrong. Here's a slide about asking people about whether they get 2 square meals a day. And if you do that, basically, you show that people are doing better over time in India. Here's some pictures of stunting, wasting, still pretty bad, underweight in the last 2 rounds of the NFHS. But you can see the nutritional indicators actually getting better. So calorie is not a good indicator of nutritional status. Calorie intake falling as nutritional status is improved. Child nutritional status is better in places in India where per capita calorie consumption is lowest, like in Kerala. Nutritional status depends on net nutrition, not on gross nutrition. Calories matter, but so do lots of other things. Poverty lines based on calories are really a bad idea. Does the calorie decline mean Indians are fine? No, because after all, they're not getting great diets and they're much too small. But still, you have to worry, and I worry a lot, that the international organizations have now switched to worrying less about hunger and diseases of hunger than non-communicable diseases. You often hear people saying most deaths in the world now are non-communicable diseases, and let's forget about these older diseases. But there are many places that are still going hungry. And just because the calorie decline is not an indicator that people are getting worse off doesn't mean you don't have to worry about them anymore. So that's what this slide is about. So let me finish by just saying a few words about looking ahead, and I'll be happy to take questions after that. In this day and age, in the middle of a pandemic, anyone who looks ahead is either a fool or is certainly taking their lives in their hands. So even before the pandemic, there's great progress in the world, but what about within countries where income inequality is rising in many, especially the US, the UK, and there are widespread increases in income inequality across the world, even in countries that were previously resistant. Wealth is much more unequally distributed, even more unequally distributed than its income. Economic growth itself, which has been this sort of miracle drug for much of this, is slowing decade by decade. That was true even before the Great Recession, and of course, even before COVID-19 came along. In a world in which GDP per capita is not growing very rapidly or even shrinking, distributional issues become much, much harder to deal with. If the economy is growing rapidly, I can have something, you can have something, and we don't have to fight with each other. If the economy is not growing, there's a zero-sum game, and what I get comes out of your pocket, and what you get comes out of my pocket. And so there's a real problem there. And I think it's one of the big reasons why politics is so much harsher today. Globalization was one of the reasons why the world gets so much better. It's been slowing and reversing even before COVID came along, and it's likely to slow more for some good reason, I say some not so good reason. Many people say that globalization was a disaster because it didn't help us get PPE, it didn't help us get drugs. But you know, for most disasters that are not world disasters at the same time, you actually want to get help from your friends and you don't want to break those links. So there's likely to be slow, but I think it's inevitable now that people are going to be pulling supply chains more domestic. They're going to be more suspicious, and that's before the disastrous trade wars that President Trump started with China. So this is going to slow or reverse growth in developing countries that depend on trade, and much of the most successes in developing countries have been through globalization. Domestic problems too. There's likely negative growth in the world in the next year. We don't know what happens after that. Everything depends on how long the pandemic goes on. The World Bank is projecting 70 million more people in extreme poverty. They have a range of projections, and that's a good thing because none of us know what's going to happen here, with obvious implications for nutrition. There are obviously a whole bunch of some of them really wicked, vicious trade-offs between livelihood and health. You know, in the US, people are very upset about social distancing. In poor countries, you can impose social distancing, but it's not at all clear it does very much. If you live in a shack township or you're really poor, social distancing and hand washing is a sick joke. And so the lockdowns are going to benefit relatively well-off people and do very little for poor people. Some people seem to think that the pandemic is not doing so badly in poor countries and spreading much less rapidly than we might have expected it to. That's not my reading of the data. The Indian data in recent weeks, the death toll in India went from 1,000 to 10,000 in a matter of weeks, doubled it, tenfold increase in a month, and shows no sign of slowing down. IMF thinks in GDP, poor countries will be hurt more than rich countries, so global inequality may increase. But as I want to say over and over again, everything depends on how long the pandemic lasts. More broadly, there's a lot of thoughts about what pandemics do to inequality. And, you know, sometimes pathogens attack people, you know, who are less well nourished, for instance. But in this case, the virus, as far as we know, doesn't really care how much money you have, who you are. It's the way we deal with the virus, these policies like social distancing or whatever, or vaccination if it becomes available. Those discriminate between the rich and the poor, because it's generally true that the rich have more ways of doing so, or evading dealing with the virus, or can implement them better than can the poor. So in the short run, at least, my general belief is that pandemics make inequality worse, because they give new opportunities for the best off to do better. Now, we're often taught in economic history that the Black Death actually promoted equality, and the story is that it killed so many people that wages rose. But you know, let's hope we're not looking forward to that. And I think in the current circumstances, what is much more likely is there'll be a great deal of long-term unemployment, and that long-term unemployment will further erode the standing of labor relative to capital, and the wages will fall. Of course, that might not happen. And you could easily get, and I'm sure we will get to some extent, and we've got it to a limited extent in the US already, threats of civic disorder, when tolerable inequalities that people hate but have lived with become intolerable. Now, of course, as inequalities widen, the most likely thing is people just put up with it, which is what they've done in the past. But it may not happen. You may get transformative change. The trouble with that is that such transformative change coming out of civic disorder is incredibly dangerous place to be. One example that people have been talking about a lot is that after the Great Depression, it produced transformative change. But, you know, in the United States, we got Roosevelt. In Germany, they got something much worse. And disorder could produce terrible outcomes. So that's all I have to say, and I'll be delighted to take some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Deaton. That was a riveting talk, and that's a global sweep of so many things from the evolution of inequities and how they have changed over time to where we are now. And there are questions, lots of questions that are pouring in. So in the interest of time and also to give voice to the attendees, I will just go through some of the questions. And I may even ask some people to, speak up in person. So one of the questions is that from Ramya Ambikapati, how does inequality as it relates to university education in the US compared to other countries, especially in low and middle income countries?
Well, historically, tertiary education in the US has been relatively good. And many of us are really worried that it's becoming much more difficult for people to afford. And I think some of that is something, I haven't really talked about this yet, so don't get me started on it until we hear till midnight, is the incredible costs of the healthcare system in the US. And, you know, we have a healthcare system that doesn't deliver much in the way of health, but costs incredible sums of money. Many of those costs are borne by state governments, and state governments are responsible for state universities and state colleges. And those educational systems in the States, you know, some of them great universities like the University of California or Berkeley, but many of them junior colleges or places where people who were perhaps working, there's one, if you read Elizabeth Warren's story, for instance, you know, she was working as a waitress, I think, and was going to college in the evening and paying nothing. She could do it out of her tips as a waitress. And then she got to law school, and then, you know, all sorts of stuff came out of that. And Bob Putnam has written about this too, and many of us actually are really worried that the mechanisms, those paths upwards that help many of us are no longer open. So that inequality, I think, is increasing in a very dangerous way. Right.
I have so many follow-up questions, but it's not just my, as a chair, I should respect other people's questions here. There are questions around how does US life expectancy compare between white Americans and other US American minorities, and they mean, I think, beyond, African Americans. And how do you expect automation and artificial intelligence to affect life expectancy? That's from Jenny Armstrong and Diana Dahlman. But Bill Masters also had a question in that context. What's the role of mental health in development, and do you believe there are deaths of despair in poor countries as well as among whites in the US? And perhaps also in ethnic minorities.
All right, that's a book worth of questions there. So let me at least try it with some of them. African Americans have always had worse life expectancy in the US than whites. That's been true as far back as we have data, and it's true today. So much of the discussion has been about the size of that gap. And that gap has been narrowing, which is a wonderful thing over the last 20 or 30 years, actually quite rapidly. The trouble is that a lot of the narrowing in that gap has happened because white life expectancy is going down, or mortality rates among whites, not all life expectancy, but mortality rates among whites have actually been rising to meet those of African Americans. And since 2013, the life expectancy of African Americans has started to fall, or mortality rates have gone up. And a lot of that is to do with the drug epidemic, which previously exempted African Americans, has now spread into the streets, especially with fentanyl, which is this drug that's 100 times more powerful than morphine, and is really deadly. So, you know, the outlook there is not super bright. Hispanics have been doing pretty well. And part of it is, I think, you know, in our book, and Case and I talk about this sort of slow drip of destruction of the white working class in the US. And the black working class was destroyed sort of before that. So it's, if you like, American capitalism coming for the very weakest and then the second weakest, and it's sort of working its way down. Hispanics have not had that experience because I think many of them, you know, are first or second generation immigrants, and America is still the sort of land of hope. One thing that's interesting in Britain is the black and minority ethnicity population has actually had lower mortality than white population until the pandemic came along, and that's been switched in the pandemic. So in that sense, blacks in Britain are more like Hispanics here. We don't have data on deaths of despair from other countries. You know, drug addiction has always been a problem. You know, one of the parallels we hint at in the book is the Opium Wars. And, you know, that was the time in China when the imperial government, the empire, was falling apart.
Right.
It was disintegrating, and the British sort of took advantage of that to maintain profitable drug addiction in China. In some ways, you could call those deaths of despair. And it's an analogy we make to the predatory behavior of the pharma companies in America recently, who were also killing people for profit. Killing people through profit by selling them drugs is not a new phenomenon. And the opium wars were a classic example of that.
Yeah, it just comes back in new avatars, I think, each decade in different places. I am going to change the subject a bit and get back to analytics in a way, and also larger issues about structural determinants. This is a question from Helen Harris Fry. She says, you talked about discrimination against women as an important determinant of health. There's been such a focus on women's individual bargaining power as a determinant of women's health, but the empirical evidence on this is so mixed. It makes me wonder if more structural determinants or collective cluster level factors are more important. Could you talk a bit about the structural determinants of gender-based inequality? Which ones do you think are most important, and which ones might be amenable to change?
Oh gosh, I wish I knew the answer to that. I'm not sure I can even talk intelligently about it. But yes, I mean, I think these are very long established inequalities that are extraordinarily difficult to do anything about. And, you know, I know less about gender than I know about race, but, you know, we're facing an enormous reckoning in the United States right now over structural inequalities in terms of race. You know, the institution at which I used to be a professor no longer exists as of yesterday. The Woodrow Wilson School is now the School of Public and International Affairs. And, you know, one hopes that that will not be just virtues.
Is it just me who can't hear now? Yeah.
Signaling.
Okay. Sorry, we lost you for the last 30 seconds.
Yeah, I don't think I said anything very much.
Okay.
I just said I hope that these things were more than virtue signaling.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? Could you expand that a bit more? What does virtue signaling mean?
But you're not going to.
Okay. We are getting a bit cut off.
going to be here. Do you think if I stop my sharing, it might help?
Yeah, maybe. Maybe, why don't you do that? You keep your camera on and I will stop sharing, because I think
Okay,
people...
no, I took my slides away, so maybe that'll be better.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah. So where are we? Okay, I will move on to next question. Sorry, Helen, if your question is not completely answered.
Not answered at all, I'm sorry, but I don't know everything.
Well, we could try. Bhavani Shankar asks, in 2009, your 2009 India calorie puzzle paper discusses data inadequacies and makes suggestions, example, like linking household living standard data and nutrition data collection. What do you think about the state of play on this globally? Are we linking these in India, but also global efforts, including LSMS, DHS? Would more linking make a substantial difference in the insights that could be drawn?
I think so, but it's a bit of a holy grail and it's difficult, right? I mean, I worked with the LSMS for many years, and it's they don't collect much in the way of nutritional data. They certainly didn't when they started. And that was partly because the LSMS was a brilliant idea or set of ideas, but they never had any money for it. So what they did was they piggybacked on other people's surveys. So they had very little leverage to change the way the surveys are done. But, you know, I think you have more people on this call who know more about the details of that than I would know. I mean, you know, the Indian data that Jean and I looked at come from getting detailed food expenditure and converting them into calories. And as I'm sure many people know, that's a very problematic thing to do. But then direct observation is a very problematic thing to do because you interfere with what people are doing while you do this. I've become somewhat of a fan. I've been working with Gallup for the last decade or so, and they have a world poll in which they ask a bunch of hunger questions. And, you know, I was part of the team that helped develop those. And I like very much these questions which ask people if they went without food, and especially if they ever went without food in order to feed their children, or if their children ever went without food. I mean, these seem to me very, you know, in places I've tried those seem to me very sensitive indicators. And it's also something you really worry about. If people, you know, are in a place where they worry about not being able to feed their children, then they're a very high priority for action. And I think, to me, that makes a lot of sense. But not everybody likes those self-reported questions. And, you know, there's a whole area of disagreement between people who like the objective questions and people who write the self-reported questions.
Right, and that is also a nutritionist dilemma because so many of the questions are self-reported and anything else is quite difficult to actually measure.
Yeah, but you've got to try to triangulate things. And, you know, in that paper, which you said very nice things about, and which actually, we're always very glad we put it in EPW because, you know, it just would not have reached the people we wanted to reach otherwise. But I probably spent more time on that paper than any other paper I've ever written. But I mean, you try to bring evidence from many places and try to put them together so that you have a coherent picture rather than relying on one favorite source.
Yeah, that's very important. I mean, I was listening to your Nobel lecture yesterday, and you said how you shut yourself in the room for a week. I think, was it that lecture, where for a week to understand papers. And I think what you did nicely is that you prevented several ministers who will never shut themselves for a week in a room to actually engage with the subject, and several nutritionists and several people reaching across various disciplines, which is why I think that paper was so effective. But,
well, Jean gets a lot of the credit for this.
Absolutely,
because,
yeah. And to Jean,
you know, it's one of these things where Marcia Sen likes to say that writing with Jean is a treat because he does 90% of the work and he gets 90% of the credit. Marcia gets 90% of the credit. I feel like that. But you didn't tell the punchline about locking myself in a room for a week, which is when I came out at the end of the week, I knew less than I did when I went. It didn't do me
I'm sure you learned a lot in that 1 week.
About how little I understood, yeah.
You're very modest. There are some questions about the pandemic and something about the food prices. We are a bit short of time, but I will pose these. And one is that the impact of COVID pandemic has a big impact on food security. Do you think moving towards more local food systems is a viable option in the context of you talking about globalization and how that has helped? And how would countries deal with the trade-offs and compensate those who lost in transition? There are worries by several people in terms of if we are black sliding, and Purnima Menon and others have written on black sliding on some of this nutrition progress we made recently, and how you foresee, what is your crystal ball saying?
Yeah. I don't think, I mean, people probably know, but I look a little bit at food prices. I don't see any big spike in food prices since the pandemic, maybe local, but not in international prices. And presumably because demand has gone down more, the supply has gone down, at least for the time being. The globalization thing is really interesting because I think one way of thinking about globalization is that it's brought us a lot of economic growth in aggregate, but it's done so at the price of real security. You know, and when I learned international trade, which was a very, very long time ago, you know, we were told that international trade was good, but there's also always an exception for national security. You know, and they were thinking about, you know, it's not a good idea if you go to war with Germany if they supply your airplanes, but I mean, it's also not a good idea if you can't reach India and China when they're supplying 80% of your drugs. And that may be very efficient. You may have a faster growing economy. People may be richer, but they're doing it at the price of a lot of risk. So right. One way of thinking about it is in terms of our portfolio analysis. We need a portfolio which has less risk and will probably have less returns as a consequence of that. So I think, you know, we're prepared to give up some economic growth. We should be prepared to give up some economic growth in order to be more secure about some of these things, whether it's local food production or whether it's local pharmaceutical production and so on. But once again, you know, we don't have pandemics very often, thank God. And, you know, usually if you have a tsunami or if you have some local destruction, you really need to be able to get stuff from abroad. And this was a very unusual crisis in that that was not true. Now it's going to, you know, as the United States sort of disgraces itself over this pandemic, it's going to be much easier for it to import personal protective equipment from Europe and elsewhere than it was 3 months ago, for example. Right. So I think there will be some switch to local production. I don't think all of it will be good. I think we'll see lower growths and more security, and maybe we'll go too far in that direction.
Thank you. There are lots of questions, but unfortunately, participants, there are great questions and we can't ask all those. But I did say, and my colleagues have kindly reminded me on the chat box, that in addition to having suppers with early career researchers, what would you suggest? What are some of you, what is your advice on how we engage early career researchers? What has worked? What has not? What advice would you have for us?
Well, you know, when I did these things, I did it because I was learning things, you know, and the young people are the people who know stuff, right? And so, you know, if I've been having dinner with a lot of junior researchers, it's because I've been picking their brain. And you know, it's also the fact that I've worked a lot with women. And I've worked a lot with women because, you know, women are systematically discriminated against in our profession. And it means they have a lot to tell us that we're not listening to. And so again, for me, it was all, you know, I don't want to take any credit for it at all, because I just went where I could learn stuff and where people could help me. And those were young researchers, and many of them were women. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think good science will break down those barriers in some sense, because, you know, that's the way we all learn. And it's been a real pleasure along the way too.
Right. So I think in a way, a lesson for us is we should really look to nurture those and pick their brains, because they do absolutely have a lot to say and not to stick in cliques of senior researchers versus junior researchers, so on and so forth. Thank you so much. I have also, of course, lots of questions like others, and I did not get to ask, especially on your views about aid and social contracts, so on and so forth. But I hope if and when I am in your neck of the woods, I can have supper with you and pick your brains on those. Thank you.
I would like that very much. And what I like most, of course, is that there will be a time when we can do that.
Yes, I mean, it seems so distant now. Never did I think I would look so longingly at a transatlantic flight, but I can't wait. So with that, I mean, this is a fascinating presentation, and I just want to let the participants know, Professor Deaton and I had a very brief email exchange last night about the content of the talk, and because the audience is new to him as our community. And thank you, Professor Deaton. I see that you have, in the short span of few hours, you have really addressed what I requested you, and this has been extremely fascinating, and we are delighted. Thank you for having us here.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
And
Bye-bye.
yeah, that closes this session, everyone. I can't, this is perhaps the highest point in the, this is the 5th year of the Academy Week, and this has been a fascinating discussion with Professor Angus Deaton. Now we have a short break. We would like you to go stretch a bit and come back, use the Zoom links for the parallel sessions. These are the exciting studies that several people are going to reveal. Some of their new trial results, new research, new insights into what's working and what's not, and how we should really think about agriculture, food systems, and nutrition. So see you all in 15 minutes in one of those Zoom rooms, please. Thank you.